There's a franchise that started with two guys racing a Mitsubishi Eclipse for a truck full of DVD players, and it's now closing out a saga worth over $7 billion at the global box office. 27 years, 11 mainline films. And the title they landed on for the finale is Fast Forever. Not fast finish, not fast farewell. Not even something with any kind of punctuation that suggests a full stop. That's a business communicating through branding, and what it's communicating is that nothing here is actually ending. But we'll come back to that, because before we talk about what Fast Forever means for the future of this franchise, we need to talk about how insane the road to get here has been, because it has been genuinely chaotic. Cast your mind back to Fast X in 2023. That film ended with Dom and his kid barely surviving a dam collapsing in real time around them. Roman and Tej's plane gets blown out of the sky. Letty and Cypher are stranded together in Antarctica, which is already one of the most unhinged narrative decisions in recent blockbuster history. And then standing in the snow like she just got back from a long vacation is Giselle, Gal Gadot's character who definitively died in Fast 6. Just there, breathing, looking great about it. And then the post-credits scenes pile on top of that, with both Hobbs and Giselle getting their own teasers, basically screaming at the audience that this story has nowhere near finished untangling itself. Fast X was a structural demolition of the whole ensemble, and whether that was intentional genius or controlled chaos is honestly up for debate. What's not up for debate is what happened after. The sequel immediately fell into development limbo. Vin Diesel floated April 2025 as a release window at one point. Then director Louis Leterrier was out here mentioning 2026 in interviews. Neither of those materialized. At Fuel Fest in 2024, an automotive event organized by Cody Walker, Paul's brother, Diesel showed up with Tyrese Gibson and started teasing April 2027. That also didn't hold. By October, reports were circulating that the film hadn't even been greenlit yet, that no cast contracts had been signed, and that no script had been finalized. Universal was apparently looking to cap the budget somewhere under $200 million, which, given the size of this cast and the scale of what Fast X attempted, is an almost absurd constraint. And through all of that noise, Diesel kept publicly insisting the film was happening. Whether that was confidence or just Vin Diesel being Vin Diesel is a question for another video. Then in January, the title dropped officially. Fast Forever, March 17th, 2028, 5 years after Fast X, which is the longest gap between mainline entries in a franchise that's been running since 2001. Diesel announced it with a photo of himself and Paul Walker from the original film, Walker handing him a car key, and wrote about legacy lasting forever, which, as a piece of marketing, is almost impossibly effective, because that image does all the emotional heavy lifting without saying a single explicit thing about the plot. That's not an accident. That's someone who understands the mythology of what they've built, whatever you might think about the films themselves. Now here's where it gets interesting from a pure storytelling perspective, because there's a real theory floating around, and I actually think it has legs. There are reports that Universal may be considering a partial reset of the Fast X storyline rather than directly continuing from that ending. The idea would be that Dante Reyes and Alan Ritchson's character Ames get their resolution not in Fast Forever, but in the Hobbs and Reyes spin-off, which is already in development following Johnson's post-credits cameo in Fast X. And that Fast Forever tells a somewhat different story, potentially with a leaner cast and a tighter scope. If that's true, it would explain a lot about why the budget ceiling is where it is. You can't resolve every thread from Fast X, service a 20-person ensemble, bring back legacy characters, handle Brian O'Connor's return, and do it all for under $200 million. Something has to give. And if Dante moves primarily to the spin-off, that actually frees Fast Forever to be a more personal, smaller scale story, which ironically might make it better. Speaking of Dante, Jason Momoa was legitimately one of the best things about Fast X. That performance was unhinged in the most committed, gleeful way. The guy played a villain who wore nail polish, played piano, and cried at his father's grave while also being genuinely menacing, and somehow it all worked. But here's my issue with how racing fit into Fast X specifically. That race sequence wasn't really about racing. It was a character showcase for Dante as someone unpredictable and dangerous, which is fine for an introduction, but it also meant that Fast X continued a trend the franchise has been stuck in for years, using races as set dressing for bigger action beats rather than as narratively meaningful events. The films that understood racing as a stakes mechanic were the early ones. When Brian raced for the first time and lost, it cost him something real. When Dom raced, there was always something being put on the line beyond just survival. That's been gone for a while. And this is exactly why the most narratively satisfying version of Fast Forever, at least in my head, ends with a race, not a chase, not Dom punching another international threat into a wall or driving through 4 buildings in sequence. A race, Dom versus Dante or whoever the final antagonist turns out to be, on a stretch of LA Road. That would connect the finale directly back to the DNA of the original 2001 film in a way that feels earned rather than calculated. It strips away the spy thriller architecture and puts the conclusion where it always belonged, in the culture these movies came from. And Diesel has actually said publicly that the film is returning to LA and going back to its street racing roots. So there's at least directional evidence that someone in that room is thinking along those lines. The Brian situation is the most delicate piece of all of this. Paul Walker's character has been kept alive in the narrative since Furious 7 through careful misdirection. Dom named his son after him, the skyline gets referenced, the emotional through line of the whole saga is still that friendship. But Walker is dead, and Furious 7 already gave him what many people consider one of the most genuinely moving send-offs in blockbuster film history. The white Supra driving off into the horizon, the road forking, that entire sequence was made with grief and love in equal measure, and you could feel both. In June 2025, Diesel confirmed that Brian will appear in Fast Forever in some form, describing it as another meaningful farewell. The technology to do it exists, a combination of AI, archival footage, and body doubles, similar to how Cody Walker was used to complete Furious 7. But the question of whether it's emotionally responsible to return to that well is genuinely complicated. The Furious 7 ending worked because it felt like closure. Going back to that character risks undermining that closure entirely, or worse, it risks looking like the franchise is using a dead man's likeness for commercial purposes rather than artistic ones. The only version of a Brian appearance that works is one where Walker's family is fully involved, fully supportive, and where the moment is clearly built around honoring him rather than the film's box office needs. Whether that's what's actually happening, only the people in those production meetings know. On the casting side, Dwayne Johnson returning is essentially confirmed at this point. His Fast X post-credits appearance made that a done deal, and there's been reporting about a genuine reconciliation with Diesel behind the scenes. Jason Statham is reportedly locked in for at least 2 more appearances in this universe, which likely means Fast Forever and a second Hobbs & Shaw film. That spin-off has been stuck in development since 2019, but producer Hiram Garcia has confirmed sequel conversations happened even back then, and Johnson has described the direction as more grounded and emotionally driven, even referencing Logan as a tonal comparison. That's a massive promise to make. Logan worked because it was genuinely about a character reckoning with his own mortality and legacy. If the Hobbs & Shaw sequel can deliver something in that spirit, not the exact same thing, but that same weight, it could be one of the better films in this universe. But Hollywood makes a lot of Logan comparisons that don't pan out. And then there's the entirely unverified but impossible to ignore claim from Diesel in late 2025 that a role has been written for Cristiano Ronaldo. That particular announcement landed with about the same energy as Diesel's previous suggestions of Robert Downey Jr. as the antithesis of Dom and Michelle Rodriguez floating Matt Damon for the cast. Make of that what you will. The broader franchise picture is where things stop pretending to be a conclusion at all. Beyond Fast Forever, there's the Hobbs and Reyes spin-off, the long-in-development female-led film that's been discussed since 2019, and the very real possibility that Universal wants a Fast 12 to exist separately from whatever the finale delivers. Diesel himself has floated the idea of expanding the finale into 3 films rather than 1. Comcast, Universal's parent company, has reportedly pushed for additional entries. The franchise has crossed $7 billion globally. Universes with that kind of commercial footprint don't retire. They transition. Fast Forever might close Dom's story while simultaneously opening a dozen other doors, and calling it a finale in that context is more of a marketing position than a narrative one. That said, none of this diminishes what this franchise actually was at its best. In 2001, street racing culture barely existed in mainstream cinema. The original film wasn't trying to be an action franchise. It was trying to capture something specific, a community, a feeling, freedom through horsepower, and belonging through competition. The family theme that became a running joke actually meant something before it became a catchphrase. The movies worked because the cars had weight, the races had stakes, and the characters felt like people worth spending time with. Somewhere in the process of scaling up, the soul got traded for spectacle. If Fast Forever genuinely brings both back, the scale and the reason the scale ever mattered in the first place, then Dom Toretto gets the send-off that a character who's been in the cultural conversation for nearly 25 years actually deserves. And if the title is any indication, the story keeps going long after the credits roll on March 17th, 2028. That's the whole point. Fast and Furious doesn't end, it just finds new roads.